thank you for joining us. My name is Todd Hall, and I'm director of the University of Oxford's China Center and a professor here in international relations. I'm also your host for today's event, and it is one that could not be more timely. The title of our event for today is Understanding China in Uncertain Times. A major question that will occupy us for our conversation today is the role of China scholars, in particular in both making sense of what is going on and how to convey that to a larger audience. At the moment, it does feel as if the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet, as if many of the things that we assumed were stable are sliding away, as if we are in the midst of a landslide, and it remains unclear how far down it will carry us. There are alarming and disconcerting changes happening within China, and the treatment of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and developments in Hong Kong in particular are of extraordinary concern. There are distressing developments in the deterioration of Beijing's relations with Washington, among other states, and the risks that brings from tensions globally. And there are also those who suffer the fallout from increased frictions and tensions, amplified by the pandemic. And here the rise in anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism and violence in a number of Western countries is a horrible example. And these are but a few of many issues. And against this background, it's very easy to lose sight of complexity and nuance, to blur the boundaries between distinct issues, to treat those who make attempts to explain as apologists, or to view developments through a singular lens. And indeed, the fact that we're having this conversation, I think, shows how far we still have to go. I doubt we would have this conversation about the United States. I find it a great irony that while it's hard to find anyone in the UK who would say that we need a better understanding of the United States, it is equally hard to find anyone who would call themselves an Americanologist. And this is because the US is presented in ways that make it seemingly comprehensible and familiar, and yet also extraordinarily diverse. In contrast, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, is often discussed in ways that make it foreign, distant, overdetermined by its history and the nature of its government, and requiring experts to decipher. And do not get me wrong, the PRC officialdom bears more than its share of blame for this, both in terms of the opacity it maintains and the self-orientalizing discourses it propagates. But we're not helped either by the totalizing ways in which we are presented with generalizations about what the Chinese think or want, quote unquote, treat the Chinese Communist Party as having superhuman unity and strategic foresight, or frame Beijing's actions with repeated references to its putative 5,000 years of history. Further exacerbating this are the ways in which discussions of the PRC have framed it as either likely to take over the globe, as if there's some throne that will ascend once its GDP and military spending reaches a certain level, or alternately, always and ever fragile and prone to a Soviet-style collapse as yet to happen. And the gravity of these two poles of thinking have made for an impoverished discussion about all the possibilities that exist in the middle. And so it's with great pleasure and great urgency too that I'm able to introduce to you today three individuals who have been injecting complexity, nuance, and more thoughtful approaches into our discussions of contemporary China. And it's truly an honor to have all three of you here. So the first is Professor Xiang Biao. Biao is the director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany, and was previously a professor of social anthropology here at the University of Oxford. And starting with his amazing study of the migrant workers of Zhejiang village in Beijing, which is an ethnographic classic widely known in China, he went on to research high-tech Indian migrant labor in Australia, and further looked at the subject of unskilled labor migration from China to Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. In particular, his book, Global Body Shopping, an Indian international labor system in the information technology industry, won the Anthony Leeds Prize in 2008. Our second participant is Dr. Ingrid a senior research associate at the Klingendel Institute and senior fellow at the Leiden Asia Center, the Netherlands. She lectures and conducts research on China's foreign policy and diplomacy, and in China's international collaboration on science and technology. She's also a policy advisor to Dutch government organizations and the European Commission. Her recent work focuses on the politicization of China's public diplomacy and the challenges and benefits of Europe-China collaboration in higher education research. And our third participant is Professor David Ownby. David's professor of history at the Université de Montréal, Canada, and is a member of the Center for Asian Studies at the same institution. He has researched a broad variety of topics, including secret societies and brotherhoods in early modern China, Chinese popular religion, and the Chinese establishment intellectuals. He's done something truly amazing with his Reading the China Dream website, in which he translates the diverse thinking of various Chinese intellectuals, offering a window onto debates and currents of thought within China. And so without further ado, Biao, would you start us off?
This is a wonderful opening remarks. And as Todd so skillfully mapped out, the current situation is a bit depressing and to some extent rather disorienting too. But I think probably it's a good news for scholars for at least two reasons. Number one, these developments, many of them are quite unexpected, urge us to rethink some assumptions or paradigms that we had kind of taken for granted or we are very used to. So this is a moment of rethinking. And secondly, this can be a good news for scholars because the public now is demanding new explanations. There are so many contradictory developments going on, and it's so complex. I think that's a time that scholars should be able to provide clear analysis. And in doing so, probably it's not enough for us just to emphasize, the situation is more nuanced, more complex than the public media cover. I mean, certainly that's true. But I think probably we also should be more bold and should break away with current paradigm instead of just nuance our understanding within the basic framework. So my main concern is that what should we do now? I mean, is there any concrete way that will help us in a way to fulfill our role as scholars to the society to meet their demand for new explanation and new understanding regarding how we should understand China. And may I just raise a small but concrete proposal, whether or not we should kind of move away China studies from area studies, but to formulate global questions, and particularly people's global questions. I mean, this is a slightly awkward formulation, but when I say people's global questions, because there are many global questions out there, but very often these global questions have been articulated from elites' perspective, including climate change, including financial stabilities, and also the situation of international conflicts. They are mainly proposed and developed by powerful elite, but the people themselves have lots of global questions, and what we observe in China actually are part of global questions. Whether or not we articulate such global questions and then approach China as specific examples of a manifestation of these global questions, as well as potentially a solution to some of global questions. As Todd just mentioned, I think it's a very interesting to think why nobody in the UK, for example, say, okay, we need a better understanding of the US. This does not mean the US is any less complex, any less predictable than China. And the people say, okay, we understand the US pretty well because we know the US is complex. Nobody will say, okay, Trump represents the US. Whoever says that, it will be quite stupid. But somehow it comes to China, situation is slightly different, right? So that China as a kind of a bounded entity, anything happen in China will be regarded as a China or Chinese question or Chinese phenomenon rather than a global phenomenon that is taking place in a particular way within the Chinese context. So that's and I just wanted to because I'm from China, so I'm in close touch with the Chinese society. I just wanted to let you know many people in China now feel the same as the people outside of China about the current changes. People inside of China have no less clear visions about how these things are going on. And they also feel disoriented, and many people feel very anxious. And this feeling actually is global. Right? It's not like China has made a very clear decision. They move along with a clear strategy. I mean, even the leadership, I'm pretty sure they are also kind of try out and try error. There's no path that has been determined. And this kind of sense of uncertainty actually is shared. And at the same time, I was just, when listening to Todd, I was thinking, okay, as Todd mentioned, the Chinese state is often presented as a unitary and a very powerful actor. To some extent, it's true. But then I look at the US. I must say that the US ruling class actually is far more coherent than I expected. I looked a bit into Silicon Valley ideology and Silicon Valley power recently. And you can see, it's a very progressive when it comes to climate change, comes to racial relations, comes to sexuality, but very conservative in terms of taxation, inheritance, economic policies. I think this is the shows as the most powerful section of the corporate world. It is representing the ruling class. And so then you have a bit of a fragmentation here and there along specific issues. But actually the US as a state, in my view, is quite coherent. If you look at how the military act and how they think. But people don't think the US as a very unitary state power. When we think of US, always think of diversity or like really everything falling apart. Probably this is the more commonality between the US state and the Chinese state to some extent. Yeah. So I think how shall we move forward and to ask people's global questions is to listen to all the internal debates that are going on in China more carefully, and don't treat their views as just information sources to be analyzed and to be used to build a certain coherent China story. Probably there's no such a thing as a single coherent China story, right? And to break up this as the China as a kind of bounded entity, but rather take it as a complex context under which many universal projects are being pursued. Yeah, Todd, I will just stop here and very happy to come back to discuss more.
Thank you very much, Todd, and also Biao for your very nice remarks. And I will echo some of it. But let me start by saying that I'm less depressed about the current situation. Actually, I'm quite positive and optimistic, although I see the challenges. And what I would like to do is briefly discuss two strands of developments that impact our work as scholars working on China or with China. And these two strands are European developments and China's developments. As for European developments, I would like to highlight 4 of them. First is that the awareness that developments in China, Chinese policies, China's behavior matter to Europe, that awareness is rising very rapidly. And not only among policymakers at central level, but at all levels, I think in government, among many stakeholders, and also among the public at large. And I think that is a good thing. It leads to more debate, more questions on China. And this helps to, let's say, elevate the China knowledge in society. It also means more work for us. Second development is that I noticed in my work that many European governments actually acknowledge a China knowledge deficit. And they are taking action and they're developing and investing in programs to expand and deepen China knowledge. And let me give a few examples. In the Netherlands, the Dutch government has established a China Knowledge Network involving not only China scholars, but also scientists working with China on technical issues, entrepreneurs, people at local government level and society at large. In Germany and Sweden, there are programs to build China competence. In the EU, there is a grant program, Europe Horizon, which has put forward calls to better share and disseminate China knowledge. So I think there's a lot of positive developments going on. Again, it's a good thing, and demand for China scholars is rising here. So I just spoke about a China knowledge deficit, and also referring to what Todd and Biao said, I think there's actually also a US knowledge deficit. So we may need to have a similar discussion on the US as well. I think people overestimate their understanding of the US, actually. A third development, attention for China in the media has increased greatly, and there's more of everything. So yes, on the one hand, there are more biased articles, or let me say articles that focus on negative developments in China, or on developments that have a negative impact for us here in Europe. That's what media do. But at the same time, I also see more room for in-depth discussion and debate on China. As for the first type of articles, the more, well, one-sided articles, I think there is a responsibility for us to convince the media to also present more in-depth or more nuance or a broader vision on China, and tell them that positive developments can be very exciting too, positive developments in China, that is. Then the fourth development, that's about perceptions of China in Europe. In the past few years, they have been deteriorating. The number of people looking negatively at China, and especially since the COVID pandemic, has risen enormously. So now about 70 to 80% of the people in Europe think negatively, or at least neutral, at best neutral about China. Only 20 to 30% still have a favorable view. This is not just a consequence of how the media reports on China, or a consequence of hawkish politicians in Western countries. I think this is also a consequence of Chinese behavior and China's statements. And this brings me actually to the second strand of developments in China. And I would like to highlight three of them. So the first one is many Chinese policies, China's behaviors, China's actions, they are worrying to us. And for example, I think we cannot underestimate the impact of the arrest and detention of Michael Kovrig. I'm very happy he's released now, or the impact of EU sanctions on not only EU institutions, but also China think tank and individual China scholars. This leads to, or it contributes to self-censorship and to fear to travel to China and to collaborate with China. There are more outspoken politicians in China denouncing Western behavior, and this leads to I would say an escalation of polarization on both sides, not only in Europe, but also on China. And the question is, can we as China researchers play a role in de-escalating these tensions? I think that is quite challenging. A second development, and that it comes very much to the fore in the research project I've been involved in the past few years, is that scientists, European scientists, increasingly encounter practical difficulties in collaboration with China. And this ranges from getting access to people, to resources, permission to do interviews, to travel, to use and share research data they have jointly gathered, getting their work published in China, or when it involves Chinese scholars getting their work published abroad. There's new Chinese legislation that impacts research collaboration. So I think this is also a very challenging development. And I would like to stress here, this is not only a perception or an experience that exists among Western scientists, but also Chinese scientists and scholars are very worried about this development. So right now we see that the collaboration is still growing, but maybe that is not so much in let's say China research. So I think China scholars are having a hard time right now. Then a third and last development is the room for international critical academic debate on China, and especially in and with China. this room has shrunk. There is still some room in some area, as David will also discuss, and I really admire his work. Very important to also show that the picture is not black and white, but at the same time, in many other areas, there is hardly any room for debate left. And over the 20 years I have been going to China, I've been lecturing in China, I've really seen this room shrunk very, very strongly. Chinese scholars have similar perceptions, by the way. Again, this contributes to censorship and also conscious or unconscious self-censorship. In summary, I think it becomes harder right now to build trust. Maybe distrust is growing on both sides among certain groups. I think this is a very worrying development. If we look at the censorship and a more difficult research climate, I see two important consequences. One is that it impacts the quality of our research because we have less access to people, to data in China, but it also undermines our knowledge position on China. On many topics, we cannot do research in China anymore. And these topics are also very sensitive for Chinese scholars to address. So we simply do not know in many areas what is happening in China right now. So what can we do about this? I would just like to put forward a few ideas or thoughts. In the first place, I think we have to keep providing facts and context to developments in China, to the media, to policymakers. To tell this more nuanced story, to better explain in a more attractive way about China, to convince the media to make room for these broader stories. And what I see right now is that it's mainly think tank people involved in these public debates, and to a lesser extent, people working their whole life in academia. I think that's very understandable. They often have no time to engage in public debates because their workload is already so big. There's no incentive for them to do so. They haven't had media training. It's not expected from them. And I think this is a great pity. So I would call for a more involvement of academic China scholars in public debates, but also to have more public debates in academic settings. I think it would be good if there would be more mainstreaming of China courses in universities. I know universities that offer China minors, for example, for students in biology or law, that they are very popular, but not all universities offer these kind of courses. I think that would be a great way also to have a more broader debate on China. And I think to move towards the second part of my story, I think we have to keep up our efforts to communicate with Chinese scholars and to collaborate with them, no matter how difficult it may become. And maybe a last remark on what Biao said. I think it's a great idea, Biao, your suggestion to maybe move a bit away from area studies and think more in global challenges and global problems. But then I would like to add that I think it's not an either or. I think we need both. I think we also still need area studies to develop this in-depth knowledge of what is going on in China. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Biao. Thank you, Ingrid. And thank all of you who showed up to listen to us. I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about things. I live in Canada, and we often choose to hide our opinions on such things. I would say, however, that I have, over the past few years, hit upon a way to introduce complexity into China research. It was kind of by accident. As Todd says, I run a website called Reading the China Dream, which I started, the first entries were in May 2018. on which I translate and curate the writings of establishment intellectuals. By establishment intellectuals, I mean intellectuals who write within the parameters set up by the Chinese state. So while some of the people I read and translate have critical opinions, they are not dissidents, and they try hard not to be dissidents. In the West, of course, we almost no Chinese intellectuals. Maybe one person out of 50 can name Ai Weiwei, but if we know them, they are intellectuals, which is an artifact of the way we look at China. It's the history of the Cold War, the fears that Todd mentioned in his introduction, and it leads us to believe that all Chinese intellectuals are either dissidents or would-be dissidents or propagandists. And I think I thought pretty much the same thing because I grew up in the United States, a prisoner of the same Cold War heritage. But about 10 years ago on a plane from Vancouver to Montreal, I happened to read a book by a Chinese establishment intellectual that was so good in terms of quality, it was like discovering a new fruit or like discovering a new color. I just didn't know that was there before. And I said to myself, first, what is this? Second, why didn't I know about this? And third, if I didn't know about this, it's probably the case that lots of people don't know about this. So over the next few years, I changed my research agenda to start to work pretty much just on this. And I first worked on the author, Xu Jilin, of the book that I read on the airplane. And then I worked on his footnotes and got to know the people he was talking about. He was writing about contemporary Chinese intellectual life. So it was a good introduction to that. And then I sort of moved on and set up the website. And what I do on the website, I translate entire texts, not just excerpts, which is a better thing, but it makes for longer reading. I try to translate authors that come from the entire spectrum of the Chinese intellectual world. I don't do propagandists and I don't do dissidents because we get those already. There are people who are paid to do this and they're well represented. They don't need me to do it again. There are also a certain number of projects that we've developed. There's a project on Chinese youth voices, or youth concerns rather, a project on Chinese women's voices. I link all the texts that I can to other texts under themes. So if you want to see what Chinese establishment intellectuals say about Black Lives Matter in the United States, you can read 15 essays, or maybe not that many, on the topic. Now, there's way too many themes I've identified, but there are Chinese-American relations, Chinese on democracy, Chinese on the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese thinkers on ideology. There are 12 or 15 themes. You just click on the link, and there you have in front of you, again, a certain number of texts that address those themes in their integrity. I think it's important to have the full text because usually when people do works like this or translations like this, they either excerpt, which is understandable. The Chinese write very long texts, sometimes wonder if they're paid by the character. Or the other thing people do is they prepare readers, which are works in advocacy. A very good reader on Chinese intellectual life from a few years ago was by Wang Qiaohua, I think her name was, and it's on the New Left, and it's very, very good. But she's of the New Left. She wanted to foreground New Left thinkers. But if you just read that one book, you think all of China is New Left, which is not the case. So I try again, to the best of my ability, to find people from the New Left, from the New Confucians, from the confusing liberal middle, and other things as well that don't fit in those categories, and present them to readers who are interested. By now, I update every 2 weeks, and usually it's 3 or 4 texts every 2 weeks. So by now I have something like 120 or 150 texts. There's several thousand pages, I guess, is on there, far more than even my mother will read, but it's a legacy, if you will, and it's there for those who are interested. And I don't only do translations, I also curate, by which I mean I introduce the texts, telling you not David Ownby's grand theory of what China means, but rather why I think this text is interesting, how it relates to other texts on there, and just not, again, trying to tie things into cosmic bows, just make it accessible to someone who's interested in China, but unable to read in Chinese, because who has time to read all this stuff in Chinese? I have Chinese followers in China who say to me, I don't have time to read all this stuff, which was not a lot of Chinese followers. Let's not get carried away here. I was surprised to get any mail from China, but in any event. What have I found by doing this over the last few years? I'll just cut to the chase and not try your patience with more technical detail about what I've done. I've found first, or what strikes me as important, it's important that this world exists. We don't really know, I think, outside of China, that a world exists where people, they can't say everything they want to say. This is not a totally free intellectual environment. But the fact they can't say everything they want to say doesn't mean they can't say anything. People say a great deal. Here's one way to think of it. People who study dissidents and the trouble they get into are studying plane crashes, right? And we should study plane crashes. We should know why the planes crash. But it's important to study as well the planes that get there, what the transport system is, what the limits of the transport system is. This world of establishment intellectuals that is incredibly active and writes far more than I could read, much say translate, is a world with its own norms, with its own logic. They're basically trying to convince one another of various things. They work within certain red lines. They're topics they cannot bring up. But still, the notion that this exists, to me, should change the way we view China. It's not monolithic. It's not controlled by the party or by the state. These are smart people who want to keep their jobs, so they watch their P's and Q's, but it's worth reading. The second thing I've learned, so its existence is on its own merits, in and of itself is important. Second thing I've learned, I think, is that it's diverse. There are a lot of different opinions about a lot of different things. Even the liberals, whom we would think like we do, are divided into many different subgroups. There are people who preach Friedrich Hayek and the importance of markets. There are socialist liberals. There are Trump liberals, for heaven's sake. So it's all over the map in China. The third thing I discovered is that it's ambitious. These are not people repeating anyone. Most of the work I've dealt with, the most interesting of it, comes with China's rise. When the Chinese people and intellectuals became aware of the fact that China had accomplished something. It's sort of funny, I think we noticed that before China did. Ganyang, an important Chinese intellectual whom I've read and translated, said in an important address one time that we discovered China's rise when we read Time magazine in 2003 or something like this. Sometimes you don't notice when great things are happening around you because so much is happening around you. But when they noticed, this was an idea that electrified the Chinese intellectual world. And it sort of meant that China was succeeding where the USSR had failed and where it looked like the United States and the West in general was stumbling. So maybe China was really returning to its former position of greatness in the world. And that is a heady idea for anybody. So my intellectuals spent a lot of time trying to reimagine the basic facts, the basic founding myths of Chinese history, Chinese contemporary life, and the Chinese future in ways that were quite astonishing. One of the things that struck me was that many of them wanted to ignore the 20th century altogether in their desire to reconnect the Chinese present and the Chinese future with the Chinese past. The 20th century was such a series of ruptures and revolutions and violence that it sort of hurt them aesthetically. So that's a very ambitious thing. I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but you can read many, many interesting essays where they're trying to do things like this. Fourth thing I noticed is this world is still evolving. It's not at all stuck in one particular place. If you look at China over the last 40 or 50 years, I can't imagine any other society that has changed so rapidly. And of course, this impacts on the way people think. People Biao's age or people younger than Biao knew a China that was completely different from people who were born in the late 50s when I was born. And as a result, the Biao and his friends write about topics that are very different than people who came up in the 70s and 80s did. And that's one of the things I'm looking at now to try to get a sense of, in fact, that's why I'm in Germany right now, to get a sense of what younger Chinese think. And one of the things that's really interesting about how they think is they came of age at a time when money and making money was really important, when your friends could leave university and go out and become a millionaire over the course of a few years. This is something that's completely outside of my experience, completely outside the experience of Chinese intellectuals in the 1980s, for instance. It just creates a new sensibility, which is worth paying attention to. And the fifth thing that I noticed, or I discovered in doing my research, is that this world of establishment Chinese intellectuals is important strategically to the world, it seems to me. In the United States, particularly, as Todd said, we either see the Chinese future as being one in which China triumphs and puts our children and grandchildren at risk, or a world where the Chinese people reject the Chinese Communist Party because it's too weak and too oppressive. The truth is probably somewhere in between those two. It does not look to me like China is going to fail anytime soon, which means we're going to have to live with it. If we have to live with China, we have to make a space in our heads and in our intellectual understandings of what a China we can live with might look like. If you read the people on my website that I've translated, these are people we could talk to, a lot of them. They don't say exactly the same things that we do, but they are not in an exotic world that cannot be dealt with, not at all. And finally, in a similar vein, I would say that this world is important to us to be citizens of the world, to get a sense of where the world is going, how the world is changing. We can decide what we want to decide about the fate of the United States and the West in general, but it's clear that the narrative where the United States was the end of history is no longer true at all. What is a or the narrative or narratives that will take us forward, I don't know. But China, as the second largest economy and a rising superpower, is clearly going to be in there. And it behooves us then to accept this level of complexity and get a better sense of how they think about themselves and about us. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. One of the questions, and one of the things that came out in this too, I think, is this interesting issue of when engaging and also speaking beyond our circles of those of us who work on Chinese. To what extent do you emphasize similarity, and to what extent do you emphasize difference? Because of course, there are things that are importantly different, and there are ways in which people see the world in different ways, or have different understandings, or different backgrounds, or different points of reference, or also different logics possibly by which they're moving through the world. But there also are important similarities and important things that possibly on the surface may seem different, but are guided by very similar logics or desires or understandings as well. And so, and Biao, you spoke to trying to frame global questions, but Ingrid, you also spoke to the importance of area studies. And David, you were speaking in some ways to this mixture of both in some ways as well. And so, and I do worry if you emphasize difference, to what extent do you fall in the trap that people will use that to create these essentialized or sized versions? And what extent you emphasize similarity, people will overlook important nuances and differences, or misread situations and expect things that actually aren't realistic expectations. And so I thought I'd throw that open throw that out as a first question. Oh, you want to? Oh.
Okay, yeah, Ingrid as well. Probably, yeah. No, I think one way for me to get out of this dilemma is to identify common questions. I mean, common question does not have to be similarity, but there is a common concerns. And once we have a clear common concerns, then the empirical differences or ideological similarities or differences will become a material to be analyzed, to be understood, rather than the dividing line of themselves. Here, I just, possibly as a way to elaborate, I want to follow what David just said, which struck me, the ambition. The Chinese intellectuals were very excited by the rise of China, not so much because they are nationalistic, because they think this is a new way to understand the human society and the human history. The ambition is to rewrite the entire understanding of so there lots of discussion about we should get out of the long 19th century, break away all this in law studies, this kind of 18th century legal theology and etc., to say that all these doctrines should be undermined. So now the world should be examined through the lens of rise of China. Of course, it's a kind of narrow, problematic as well. But this ambition, I think, is interesting. Now the question, as Todd, you mentioned earlier, then lots of language from the Chinese officialdom or some scholars are quite narrow-minded, essentialistic and nationalistic, which is not helpful at all. So that is a question I'm thinking, why is that so? Why they have the ambition to speak about the global issues, but they do not have the language to do so? My understanding is that all these annoying noises coming from China is due to the lack of proper language and the proper analytical tools. So I think that will probably be our task to think China as a part of global questions and develop new global languages. And then again, similarity and the differences question also tied to what Ingrid mentioned a few times, the question of debate. I think that's really interesting. Space of debate are, shrinking. And then we have been thought of, okay, we should make the story more nuanced, more and emphasize the complexity. I'm not sure whether or not this strategy will work. For the public audience for them to become more interested in China and also to learn more from the Chinese experiences. Actually, we should probably consciously develop some lines of debates. But the debate should not be about, will China succeed, take over the world, or will China will collapse? It's all about the prediction, fortune-telling type of debate, which has been the common state of affair. But whether or not as a debate, the question of debate can be more nuanced and at the same time more globally relevant, then China become part of that. So whether or not we have too few debates of this kind, I think that is a problem. Finally, that again, the similarity and the difference question. I'm also thinking now, it is one thing that we have lots of negative impression about China, and it's another thing that the people just lose interest. They don't want to hear about China. I just talked to a friend yesterday in South Korea. They said, it's quite difficult nowadays to persuade publishers in South Korea to publish about China. Why? Because there's lots of negative stories. So I thought it's quite interesting why negative stories will reduce your curiosity. It means it's a particular type of negativity. But if we can turn that kind of negative, it's fine, you have negative impression, but can we turn it into an interesting line of debates? Then you will attract more audience. Yeah, that's my response.
Thank you. Ingrid, you wanted to respond as well?
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with you, Biao. It's about the content of the debate. So when I called for more debates, I didn't mean in general debates, but maybe also better organized, better focused debates. I think it's not a matter of focusing on challenges of similarities. I think they always need to figure in any debate and in any discussion on China. And what can help in, for example, in debate is ask the participants what they do, what they see in terms of similarities or differences. I think that's often an eye-opener to many people. What I also think is this is why it is so important to keep having discussions and debates with our Chinese colleagues. Because it's often my Chinese colleagues in research projects that help me see the differences and similarities. So I'm maybe not only the content of the debate we should take care of, but also who is participating in the debate. And especially now with only having online opportunities, it becomes very difficult, but I would call for including more Chinese scholars in international debates. And it is possible. We have done so a couple of times also here in the Netherlands, and we need more of that.
Thank you. David.
Yes. These are very interesting questions. In my own particular work, I push more on similarity than difference because that's where I am with a project. But in terms of debates, one thing that strikes me, and it struck me a lot as I've worked on these texts and these authors over the years, is how much more the Chinese know about us than we know about them. It is absolutely astonishing. Beginning in the 1980s, China began to translate large numbers, not just of first order works of social science, literature, philosophy, and everything, but they're down to second and third order people now. These are not always translated with great skill. In fact, they're sometimes translated quite poorly. But these authors that I read and who don't read English themselves cite vast bodies of Western scholarship that I've never read. So if we could, as Ingrid and Biao suggested, bring them into the debate, I think it'd be very interesting. The barrier of language remains a real problem. If someone who speaks reasonably good English, but with an accent is often not taken seriously, I don't know what we do about that. But I think it's very clear that many Chinese are concerned with many of the same things that we are. One of the major topics that my guys and girls talk about in China is governance, which is their way of talking about how you govern a society well. They wanted to create new language so they could talk about it without running afoul of what the party sensitivities were about constitutional rule or about the various institutional aspects that we associate with democracy. It's one way of doing an end run around the constraints that they face. But who's not concerned about good governance? It's a worldwide concern. And the Chinese have a great deal to say about this. We might not agree with them, but a debate, a serious debate and a platform that allowed everyone to express him or herself fully and clearly would be very eye-opening, I'm quite sure.
I think that gives us a good opening too to turn to some of the questions we've been getting. And so two of the questions I see already are very much along the similar lines. And the first one says, how can China studies scholars position themselves in academia and outside when they constantly face situations where they need to be taking sides? And of course, with debates too, there's often ways in which taking a side of a debate or engaging in a debate then creates the image that there are two sides as well. And this also, another attendee also asks that, saying from the China Research Group, making the following recommendation that the government should formalize links with the independent China centers at universities and should consider setting up an extra-governmental body to harness the considerable expertise of the UK sinologists. But it asks, how can sinologists and China departments balance the suggestions made by the panelists of being vocal in public life and being potentially sucked into a situation by working with the government, et cetera, where academic life is distorted too. And this gets, in some ways, also touches upon the ways in which you're pulled into responding to questions that you're not posing in ways that the questions also may force you into taking sides or position you to give certain answers. Shall we go in reverse order this time? David, would you like to take a first?
No, let's not go in reverse order this time. No, I don't. That's an excellent question. I wish I had an excellent answer, but I don't. It's extremely, this happens with journalists, it happens in all sorts of contexts where you're asked a gotcha question for which there's no real answer. I have there are no good answers to this. You just have to point out over and over again that next to that question, there's another question or another way to look at things. At the same time, without taking the other side. I mean, the way I think about this, no part of me thinks that what I'm doing is getting at a level of Chinese reality that other people don't understand. I mean, people who work on dissidents should keep working on dissidents, spies should keep spying, government analysts should keep analyzing, whoever's doing what they're doing should keep doing what they're doing. But this just adds another layer, another big part of the picture. But that's not at all an answer to your question, Todd. I'm hoping my fellow panelists have thought up something better by now. But it doesn't look like it's the case.
Ingrid, do you want to take
Yeah,
a stab?
I'm happy to say a few words. I think it always works well when you stick to providing the context and an analysis of a situation, and make clear it is not always a matter of taking sides. And even in some discussions, I do take a side, but then you still highlight other arguments. So I think that it's a very simple answer, but if you try to always present the major arguments on the whole spectrum, you can leave it up to other people to take sides, or you can explain why in the end, in the balance, you still take one side.
Yeah, I'm a fan of debates, so therefore I'm not afraid of taking sides. But look at the historical experiences. China is a society actually loves debates, and the communism movement is full of debates between Lenin and Rosenberg. Now I'm in Halle, and this is the street is called Rosenberg Street. So they take sides, but they each now we know have a historical limit. But their debate about, for example, the nature of war and the question of especially nationality is tremendously important politically and intellectually. And in the West, in Oxford now, where Todd is sitting, you have debates like between Isaiah Berlin and Edward Carr, the historians. How should we explain or understand the victory of the Soviet? And then the Cold War period, the 1960s, to 1980s. If you look at the UK and to some extent in the US, culturally, intellectually, very vibrant, in many ways, much more, in Berlin, and again here, much more interesting than it happened after 1990s. Why? Because there were sustained debates within the Western Bloc. So therefore you have all kinds of sparks and a new way of thinking, right? Why there are the lively debates? Because the world was divided into capitalism and socialism. You have, realistically, there's two paths in terms of how human affairs can be organized. So debates is, you take a side, but then what's the trick? Why I can understand there's a problem now today. Now, as if you take a side is you kind of have established a particular relation with a particular power block. So we have to get away from that. How do we do that? That is our chance. We need intellectual force to formulate the question as a way to thinking how human affairs should be organized, rather than to justify whether or not the Chinese government is correct or whether or not we should support the US government. We have to go beyond that level. How do we do that? I think this really interdisciplinary collaboration is very important. The economic policy, like in China, crack down on these tech companies. How should we understand that? You cannot understand that only in terms of corporate governance or economic terms, but you have to understand it through political lens as well as philosophy, because a lot of things is unknown. Empirically, no one knows what's really going on. So you have to come in with a higher level of a principle than in order to develop a certain intellectual analytical position. So that's, I think, is a chance. We have to engage, because all these questions, the world is divided. This reality is a reality we have to confront. Then how do we engage? We must engage, but yet we don't want to take a political side. And the way for us to do it is to translate into a deep and a large intellectual question. Then we will have a very fruitful debates. I'm very confident about that, actually. The reason we have not done that is because scholars have not done enough work. If you look at history, lots of interesting debates have been the driving force of social science development.
Thank you. And so I'll take another question from our audience. And it says here, the language barrier is obviously two-way. Do Western governments express their concerns about a rising China, i.e. respect for rules-based international order, fair industrial competition, free access to seaways, etc., in ways that are accurately understood in China? And similarly, do Western governments and alliances present themselves as welcoming enough to deeper and more pointed debate? But I think that gets to the issue too, though, is we are engaged in an environment where also, because it's populated by political actors who are engaged in this debate, they're not always engaging in debate, how should I say, in good faith as well. And so how does one, when one comes from an academic perspective or such, engage in debate when it is one in which not just there's a language barrier, but there's also a number of actors whose engagement in the debate is not necessarily the pursuit of better understanding, so to speak. Ingrid, would you like to comment on that at all? Putting everybody, everybody gets their time on being put on the spot first.
Now, this is difficult again, and then some people you can not convince to open up and listen to other part of the stories or another narrative. So they simply will not hear it. And I've been in meetings where people, round tables, where people only wanted to hear their own views confirmed instead of listening to what others had to say. So I think then there's little what you can do. Just stick to your own to your own story, the story you would like to tell. But I would like to bring up another element here, is that even when we have our discussions with the Chinese side, and maybe not so much the people working already for a long time on China, but let's say a broader audience of policymakers, there may often be miscommunication, because sometimes people in China, we use the same words, but we mean different things with them. And this is an awareness that's just being broadened right now. There have some tools being published, the Decoding China dictionary, for example. I think that's very helpful. But I think we also need a broader awareness of this different understanding of concepts on both sides, so that you reduce the miscommunication.
Yeah, no, can I jump in? I know I have spoken too much, but I think that again is a great opportunity. You know, okay, the concern about the rise of China is about the establish the rules and the fair competition. Then for us as scholars, immediately that raise the question, what does it mean by international rule? What does it mean by fairness? I mean, that was a debate actually just probably more than 10 years ago, about how, whether or not the Qing dynasty, the Qing court, the treatment of all these treaties were acceptable or not. And we know colonialism is to a great extent based on law. The signed treaty is legally binding documents, but it is based on very unequal power relations. So that time, Chinese scholars were debating this question. On one hand, that is a law, and there is such a thing as international law. If you sign this treaty, the Qing court must abide to this law. This is your duty. But at the same time, there is also power relation behind that. And they were debating actually the cause of the Second Opium War. It's because the Qing court did not fully follow the treaty that they signed, etc. So then then again, today's international law, of course, is different from the 19th century, but still the origin, lots of fundamental principles actually was developed in the 19th century during colonialism, right? So, I mean, it's not to say everything is just a power game and etc. That is simplistic too. And because nowadays we have to find the rules to live together. So for us, so that can be translated to a question of what is fairness, what is the really basis of justice, and the reason that people cannot hear each other, the West of China, precisely because they have not reached to that level to reflect the history and the assumption behind this. The rule. Everyone has their own rules, but they did not go deeper to reflect where these rules come from. So if once we reach that level, we could bridge the differences. Yeah.
But I think what we're getting though too is again, it's a very tricky environment to navigate, because it is, the one hand, there's a desire for debate and a conversation. I think, David, in some ways you're allowing that conversation to happen with your translations, but it's not a direct conversation. It's one that's happening indirectly through the presentation of some of these thoughts into the English speaking. David, do you want to say something on that?
That's why I don't have a discussion section on my site.
Yeah, but that's the thing too. I mean, that's fascinating that you don't have a discussion section, because so very quickly it turns into something, right?
It does indeed, yes.
And that's a territory I think we're all navigating at the moment, and trying to figure out how to participate in this realm, but at the same time, how quickly it can get hijacked or taken down one path or another. And so here's a further question. Is the main problem we face as China scholars one created by China's official narrative about itself, or is it the reaction outside China to that narrative? David.
Those are self-supporting. I see the rise of wolf warriors or that kind of diplomacy as being a regrettable but completely understandable reaction on the part of China to relentless criticism and condemnation. I had a colleague at the University of Montreal, a Chinese friend, who once said it was sort of like China had once been grossly obese and lost lots of weight. And the West, instead of saying, you look really good, said instead, you know, when you turn that way, your butt still looks pretty big. And I mean, it's kind of a gross thing to say, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. If someone tells you over and over again that what you're doing is wrong, you stop trying to do right. If you accuse your spouse day after day after day of cheating on you, well, your spouse will say, what the hell, and finally cheat on you. This excuses nothing of the bad actions in which China engages in. But, and it may be, I don't know how to get past this. I don't know when China made that decision that it didn't matter anymore. But it is almost impossible to find any positive news about China in any outlet anywhere, no matter what China does. So at a certain point, I think it's a very human reaction, although again, I think it contributes greatly to disharmony in the world and to those who are pessimistic about the future.
Of course, I've noted with great interest too, the way in which the terms positive and negative are used. And often the assumption that, you know, either you say something that's positive or you say something that's negative, or that and this gets to the way in which too, saying, for example, how one sees it. It could be negative, it could be positive, it could be a mixture of both, but having to be concerned about where that falls on that spectrum of negativity or positivity, and what discourses you're then contributing to, as if there's somehow a scale that you add more negative on one side or add more positive on the other side, and then you're tipping the balance somehow. Ingrid, do you want to?
Yeah, what I would like to bring in is that I think China's narrative hasn't changed that much. It is that we were not aware of this narrative. And I was sometimes surprised myself when I started looking into China's science and technology ambitions and studied policy documents from 20 years ago. These ambitions were already there, loud and clear. It's just that we ignore them. So I think it is more our own interest in China, the way China's development impacts our life, that has made us look with different eyes to this same narrative. And I think it is important. Yes, the narrative has become more explicit, but it has been there all along. It hasn't changed fundamentally.
I think you're both bringing up an interesting point, is that the People's Republic of China is also dealing with a scrutiny it's never had at this level before. And I've probably had some expectations that once we're, as sort of what David was saying, once we're strong and we've grown, that suddenly everybody will look up to us and give us all this wonderful respect and all these things. And it's now under a scrutiny and learning to deal with the scrutiny or I don't know if learning is the proper word, but facing the scrutiny that that it hasn't ever had to face before. Ingrid, yes.
Yeah, if I may briefly respond to that, what is interesting, I feel, and I've had conversations with Chinese colleagues about this, that indeed China finds it very difficult to deal with this scrutiny and difficult to deal with negative perceptions and negative comments. And that's something where we are used to, I think, in our societies, and our politicians are used to being strongly commented upon all the time. And then we started a discussion, but it was too brief. We couldn't finish it. Why that was the case, and how we maybe both sides could work towards, well, helping China to better deal and respond to these. To this international scrutiny. Maybe Biao, you have some ideas on this.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Actually, China sometimes feel sieged, and it's simply because people ask more questions, people have more doubts, and they're not used to it. So therefore, practically, I think encouraging China to develop its own international studies is a very important project. A few universities are doing that already. Government is supporting it, but mainly tied to its One Road, One Belt project. So personally, I think it's really important because now, as David mentioned, lots of ambitious intellectual project. Unfortunately, it's still kind of reactive. It's always wanted to, to attack the so-called West and etc. Instead of developing a genuinely parallel or alternative series which can incorporate the received established wisdom, right? Or you can adjust. But now it's try to just discredit the entire knowledge paradigm, which is not helpful at all. The reason is because I think the global studies in China is too weak. So China is thinking of itself and then an imagined world, which is basically often just the US. So they are thinking this kind of bilateral relations. Very few scholars in China study India or study Africa in depth. They study Africa as a kind of just international relations or development aid project, rather than really Africa as a society with its own history and culture, etc., and all Latin America. So awareness is also quite low. So basically, often it ends up in like a coral with a certain imagined, simplified Western narrative, rather than in-depth understanding that they can use, Chinese experience as reference point, then reinterpret experiences in Africa. That will be such a fruitful project to do. So yeah, I think, as a scholars, I would really urge the entire world to support global studies in China.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're coming to the end of our time now. Very good. And for other events from the Oxford China Center too, please do see our website. We will be having a newsletter that will be coming out either today or tomorrow, listing various events throughout the term. So, and you can sign up too for our regular email list to receive the latest information about events and other seminars that are happening at the Oxford China Center. And we will be having a lot of those online over the coming term. So I want to thank our guests again for what has been a wonderful conversation, very thought-provoking. I don't know if we've answered all questions, of course, but I think we've certainly posed quite a few more. And I look forward to seeing the conversation continue. Thank you.
Thank you.